Welcome, traveler, to the village heart. Come in out of the night, and let me tell you a story while you rest a while. Settle in, get comfortable, and whenever you're ready, let your eyes close, and let me carry you off to our cozy little village, where the days are slow and everyone has a story to tell. Stay as long as you like. I hope you leave well rested. Tonight we'll pay a visit to Mrs. Mathers on a rainy spring evening while she bakes. And if you're patient and very lucky, she might just share the secret to her famous crumb cake. So make yourself warm and let's begin. The rain came in the way it sometimes does in early spring. Not gently, not politely, but all at once, as though the sky had been holding something in for too long and finally decided it had waited long enough. Most sensible doors in the village were shut against it. Lanterns burned warm behind glass. Cats had found their windowsills. The old elm on the green was doing its best, which was considerable, and the cobblestones shone like they were proud of it. But if you followed the smell of baking bread, and on a night like this you could, past the little bridge where the creek was carrying on quite dramatically, you'd find yourself at the end of Wren Lane. And at the end of Wren Lane, in a cottage with yellow curtains and a chimney doing serious, dedicated work, was Mrs. Mathers. She'd had the fire going since morning. Not because she was cold exactly, though the rain had brought a chill with it that even April hadn't expected. She had the fire going because bread wants warmth. And besides, there was jam to think about. The jam was from last summer, strawberry, put up in the good jars, the ones with the little ridges on the side that caught the light when you held them to the window. She'd made a dozen of them that July. A dozen, because a dozen is a nice even number. And Mrs. Mathers had always felt that there was something deeply satisfying about a nice even number. She'd told herself the whole time that 12 was far too many, that she'd never get through 12, that she was a foolish old woman with a foolish old habit of making too much of everything. And she hadn't got through 12. She never did. But not because 12 was too many. It was because somewhere between July and now, a jar would find its way out the door. There was the jar that went to poor Edith, the blacksmith's wife, the morning her cat Marmalade got himself stuck up the old elm and wouldn't come down for love nor fish, and half the village stood about in the road giving advice while Edith wrung her hands. Mrs. Mathers had arrived, had a look, and sent Edith home with a jar of strawberry jam and strict instructions to put the kettle on and stop watching. By the time the tea was poured, Marmalade had got bored of being stuck and come down on his own, the way cats nearly always do the moment no one is looking. The jam, Mrs. Mathers maintained, had calmed everyone down, Edith and the onlookers, and, she would add, with a particular twinkle, Marmalade himself, who got a saucer of cream to go with the general mood and forgot the whole affair entirely. That was how a dozen jars became, by spring, the last jar. Folks need a jar of strawberry jam now and then, was how Mrs. Mathers saw it, more often than you'd think, and it does the trick more reliably than almost anything. So that was the plan on a rainy night in early spring. Bread, warm from the oven, the last of the strawberry jam, and the fire, which asked for nothing and gave a great deal, much like the best sort of company. Now, you should know something about Mrs. Mathers' kitchen, because it is going to matter, and because it is worth knowing in any case. It was not a large kitchen. It had a low ceiling that a tall man would have to mind, though there were no tall men in it tonight, only Mrs. Mathers, who at 5'2" had never once in her life needed to mind a ceiling. The table in the middle was scrubbed pale and soft from years of scrubbing. There was a dresser against one wall with plates standing up in it, blue-rimmed, none of them quite matching, all of them somehow right together. There were dried herbs hanging from a beam, and a window over the sink that looked out at the garden, though tonight the window looked out mostly at rain, and at the warm reflection of the room itself. And there was the purse. It sat on the chair by the door where it always sat, large and dark and patient, like a creature that had decided this was its spot and would not be argued with. Nobody in the village knew everything that was in that purse. Nobody, possibly, including Mrs. Mathers. It was generally understood that if you ever found yourself in a difficulty, a real difficulty, the kind that makes your stomach go cold, the very best thing you could do was find Mrs. Mathers. And the second best thing you could do was wait while she opened that purse and had a look. There was the time the librarian, poor flustered Mr. Penhollow, had locked his keys inside the library with the evening reading club waiting on the steps in the cold. Mrs. Mathers had happened to be passing. She'd set down her purse, had a thoughtful rummage, and produced a small leather roll of lockpicks. She'd had the door open before Mr. Penhollow had finished apologizing for troubling her, when someone asked, quite reasonably, why on earth she carried lockpicks. She'd only said that she'd had them laying around, and that it seemed a shame to leave them at home. Nobody pressed her on it. You learned not to press Mrs. Mathers on the contents of her purse. It was a bit like pressing the weather. You'd get an answer, but it wouldn't be the one you were after, and you'd feel slightly silly for having asked. But that is a story for another night. Tonight there is bread and rain and the last of the strawberry jam, and we have got rather ahead of ourselves, because the dough is only just resting. She'd mixed it slowly. That was her way with bread. Some people attacked their dough as though it had wronged them, but Mrs. Mathers had always felt that bread responded to patience the way most things did, people included. So she'd worked the flour and the water and the little bit of yeast together without hurry, and she'd kneaded it on the soft, pale table with the heels of her hands, folding and turning, until it stopped being a sticky, difficult thing and became smooth and willing and warm. Then she'd set it in a bowl near the fire, covered it with a cloth, and left it to let it think things over. This is the part of bread making that nobody puts in the stories, because nothing happens in it, and yet it is the most important part of all. The waiting. The dough sitting quietly by the fire, rising in its own time, doing the slow, secret work that you cannot rush and cannot watch and cannot help with. You simply have to trust it. You have to believe that under the cloth, in the warmth, something good is happening, even though you can't see it. Mrs. Mathers had always rather liked that part. So while the bread thought things over, she put the kettle on. The kettle was an old thing, copper gone soft and brown with age, and it took its time the way old kettles do. She set it on the hook over the fire and watched the flames a while, which is a thing worth doing on a rainy night. Watching a fire. The way the orange light moved. The way a log would settle suddenly with a small shower of sparks and then go quiet again. The way the heat reached out and touched your face like a gentle caress. The rain kept on against the window. It had settled into a steadier rhythm now, no longer flinging itself about but coming down in earnest, the way rain does when it means to keep at it for the whole night. There is a particular comfort in being warm and dry inside while the rain comes down outside. It is one of the oldest comforts there is. Mrs. Mathers felt it now, the way she'd felt it 1,000 times, and she let herself feel it fully, because she had learned long ago that comforts are meant to be felt fully or not at all. The kettle began to make the first small sounds of thinking about boiling, and it was just then, just as the kettle began to murmur, that there came a knock at the door. Now, a knock at the door on a stormy night might be many things. It might be trouble. It might be news. In a great many stories, it is the beginning of something dreadful. A stranger on the step with rain dripping from his hat and a secret in his eyes. But this is not that sort of story, and this is not that sort of village. And Mrs. Mathers did not so much as glance at her purse. She simply wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door and opened it, because that is what you do when someone knocks on a rainy night. You open the door and you let the warm out into the cold for a moment so that someone else can come into it. It was young Tomas from 2 lanes over. Though he wasn't so very young anymore, Tomas, he had a job now at the mill and a way of standing that suggested he was still getting used to the length of his own arms. But to Mrs. Mathers, who had bandaged his knees when he was small and given him biscuits over a great many years, he would always be young Tomas, and there is no use arguing with that. He was soaked through. Properly soaked, the kind of soaked where the rain has found its way past the collar and down the back, and he stood on the step looking sheepish and dripping and cold. "Mrs. M," he said, "I'm sorry to trouble you. I was walking back from the mill and it came down so fast and your light was on and I thought..." "You thought right," said Mrs. Mathers, and she stepped back from the door. "Get in here before you catch your death on my doorstep, and I have to explain it to your mother." And so Thomas came in, and the warm closed around him, and Mrs. Mathers shut the door against the rain. She had him out of his wet coat in under a minute. The coat went over the back of a chair near the fire, where it began at once to steam gently and smell of wet wool, which is quite a good smell when there is a fire and bread on the way. She found him a blanket from somewhere. She always had a blanket from somewhere, and she sat him down at the soft pale table and put the now boiling kettle to proper use, and within a very few minutes there was a cup of tea in front of him, the steam rising off it in lazy curls, and the cold was already beginning to lose its argument. Tomas wrapped both hands around the cup. That is the thing to do with a cup of tea on a cold, wet night. You don't drink it straight away. You hold it first, and you let the warmth go up through your fingers and into your arms, and you feel the cold being pushed slowly back, and only then, when the holding has done its work, do you take the first sip. He took the first sip. "That's better," he said, mostly to himself. "It generally is," said Mrs. Mathers. She watched him in the unhurried way she had of watching people, as though she had all the time in the world and could think of no better use for it than this. And she saw, the way she always saw, that the cold was not really the trouble. "You've got the look," she said after a while. Tomas looked up. "What look?" "The one your father used to get. Like you're carrying something heavy, and you've forgotten you're allowed to set it down sometimes." She said it kindly. She said most things kindly. But she also said it as a plain fact, the way she said most things. And Thomas didn't argue, because there is no arguing with a plain fact said kindly by Mrs. Mathers. He looked down into his tea, and it came out of him slowly. The mill and the books they'd given him, to keep now on top of the floor work, and how the numbers all ran together when he was tired, and how he was tired most of the time, and how he wasn't sure he was any good at any of it, and how that not being sure had started following him around like a dog that wouldn't go home. Mrs. Mathers listened to all of it. She did not rush him, and she did not fix it, because some things are not for fixing, only for setting down a while. And when he had finished, and the kitchen was quiet except for the rain and the fire, she stood up and rolled her sleeves to the elbow. "Right," she said. "I'm going to teach you how to make a proper crumb cake." Thomas blinked. "Now? It's exactly the right time," said Mrs. Mathers. "It's always exactly the right time for a cake. Up you get. You're going to help me. A heavy night wants busy hands, and washed ones at that, so get to washing them." It is well known in the village that Mrs. Mathers makes the finest crumb cake anyone has ever tasted. This is not in dispute. It has been tried against all comers at every fair and every gathering for longer than most people can remember, and it has never once been beaten. And it is equally well known that there is a secret to it, one ingredient, one small thing, that nobody has ever managed to guess, and that Mrs. Mathers has never told a living soul when asked. People have tried everything to get it out of her. They've asked her outright, and she's smiled and changed the subject. They've tried to be clever, asking sideways questions, and she's seen them coming a mile off. They've offered her things. One year, young Thomas's own grandmother offered Mrs. Mathers her best laying hen in exchange for the secret, and Mrs. Mathers had laughed so hard she'd had to sit down, and she'd kept the friendship and the secret both, and the hen stayed where it was. But everyone in the village knows the real truth of it, which is this: if you sit with Mrs. Mathers long enough, on a quiet enough night, with the rain coming down, and nowhere in particular to be, she will tell you. Not because you got it out of her. You can't get anything out of Mrs. Mathers that she doesn't want to give. But because the secret was never really the point. The secret was only ever a way of making sure you stayed long enough to be cared for. Now you may be wondering how Mrs. Mathers makes a crumb cake, and I will tell you, but I must warn you that you will not be able to follow along, and neither could Thomas, and neither, in all honesty, could anyone, because Mrs. Mathers did not measure things. "How much flour?" asked Thomas, hovering over the big chipped bowl with the bag in his hands. "However much your heart feels," said Mrs. Mathers. "My... what?" "Your heart. It knows. Tip it in until the bowl looks right and then stop a little after that." She watched him pour, far too carefully, his whole face screwed up with worry. "More than that. There you are. Now a good couple of handfuls of sugar. No, a heavy handful, Thomas. No one was ever sad from a bit of extra sugar. And the butter, cold, broken up small. You do it with your fingers like so." And she showed him, her old hands working the cold butter into the flour, rubbing it between her fingertips until it went to soft crumbs. And somehow as she did it, the flour seemed to leap. It got onto the table and onto her apron and onto Thomas, a soft pale dusting on his dark hair, so that he looked, suddenly, 20 years older. And then, when he laughed, about 7. It got onto the floor. It got impossibly onto the ceiling, though no one saw it go. The whole kitchen took on the floury chaos of any real kitchen where something good is being made. The chaos that always feels, in the moment, like it will never come right again. "A pinch of cinnamon," said Mrs. Mathers, during the chaos. "However much smells like enough. You'll know. Stop when the kitchen smells like the inside of a hug." Thomas added the cinnamon, and instantly the kitchen smelled like the inside of a hug. "Now," said Mrs. Mathers, and her voice changed, just slightly. "This is the part. This is the secret, the real one, the one I've never told when asked. So you listen." Thomas listened. She went to the cupboard and brought down the last jar of strawberry jam, the very last, the bottom of the summer. And she opened it, and the smell of it, when the lid came off, was the smell of a hot July morning, in the middle of a rainy April night. She set a spoon in it. "1 spoonful of jam," she said, stirred right in. Not so much that anyone could ever name it, just enough that they can't. She spooned it in, deep red, glistening, a whole strawberry coming with it. My mother taught me this, in this very kitchen, when I was younger than you and just as sure I'd never be any good at anything. And her mother taught her, the exact same way. However much your heart feels, and a dash of this, and a pinch of that, and a spoonful of jam stirred in at the end. "That's it?" said Thomas. "Jam?" "That's not it," said Mrs. Mathers. "That's only the first part. Any jam will do, mind. It doesn't have to be mine, doesn't have to be strawberry, doesn't have to be anything special. Any jam at all. Because the jam isn't the secret. The jam is just where you put the secret." "I don't..." "A spoonful of kindness," said Mrs. Mathers. That goes in next. You can't see it and you can't measure it, and don't ask me how much, because the answer is the same as the flower. Your heart knows. And then she leaned toward him, and the fire popped, and the rain came down, and she said it the way her mother had said it to her, in this very kitchen, a very long time ago. And then, just before it goes in the oven, you lean down close, and you whisper something good to it, something true and kind. It doesn't matter what. It matters that you mean it, and that it's kind. That's the secret. That's the whole secret. My mother said the cake can taste the difference, and I've never once known her to be wrong about anything that mattered. Thomas looked at the bowl. He looked at Mrs. Mathers. And then, because the night had made him brave, and because his hands were full of flour, and his heart was, for the first time in weeks, not carrying the heavy thing, he leaned down close to the bowl, and he whispered something into it. Mrs. Mathers did not lean in to hear. That is not done. What you whisper to the cake is between you and the cake. Whatever it was, he came up smiling. Good lad, said Mrs. Mathers softly. It'll be the best one I've made all year. They always are, when someone learns it for the first time. While the cake baked, they had bread and jam, because the bread had come out of the oven by then, golden and steaming, the crust cracking softly under the knife, and because you cannot stand about waiting for a cake on an empty stomach. She spread the jam thick. She was not a woman who spread jam thin. The butter first, soft enough to melt into the warm bread, and then the jam over it, deep red and glistening, with whole pieces of strawberry in it, because she never could be bothered to mash them down all the way. Thomas ate it the way you eat something that is exactly right, when you very much needed something that was exactly right. And somewhere in the middle of it, the last of the heavy look went out of his face, and what was left underneath was just young Thomas, warm and dry and fed, with the rain shut safely outside and someone who loved him sitting across the table. And the cake in the oven did its slow secret work. The same slow secret work the bread had done under its cloth. The work you cannot watch and cannot rush and can only trust. And the smell of it grew and grew until it filled the whole cottage and made the rain outside seem very far away. By the time it came out, golden and crumbling and smelling of cinnamon, and that one nameless spoonful of summer, the kitchen, and this is the part no one has ever been able to explain, was clean. The flour that had been everywhere was simply gone. The bowl was washed and standing in the dresser. The table was scrubbed pale and bare. When this had happened, Thomas could not have told you. He'd been there the whole time. He'd watched the cake go in and watched it come out, and somewhere in between the chaos had simply resolved itself, the way it does in Mrs. Mathers' kitchen, the way it never quite does in anyone else's. He decided not to ask. You learn not to ask Mrs. Mathers certain things. It was a bit like the purse. When it had cooled just enough, she cut a single thick slice, for him, not for her, and set it on a blue-rimmed plate, the crumbs tumbling soft and golden, a thread of steam still rising off it. Go on, she said, while it's warm. There is nothing better than a warm crumb cake on a cold, rainy night, and I won't have you arguing the point. Thomas did not argue the point. He ate it slowly, the way you eat something made with more care than you'd known you needed. The cinnamon, and that one nameless spoonful of summer, and underneath it all the something good he had whispered into the batter, which he never told her, and she never asked after. And somewhere in the middle of that slice, he sat back in the warm kitchen and let out a long, slow breath, the kind a person doesn't realize they have been holding for weeks. It was getting late. The fire had burned low and good. The rain had eased, not stopped, never quite stopped, but eased into the soft, steady hush that rain becomes at the very end of a long, wet night, when it's nearly done, and is only seeing itself out. Thomas's coat had dried by the fire. His eyes had that heavy, warm look that has nothing to do with carrying anything. The look of someone who is full and safe and beginning, just beginning, to think about sleep. Mrs. Mathers wrapped what was left of the cake in a clean cloth, all of it but the one slice she had set aside for her own morning, and pressed the warm bundle into Thomas's hands. "Take it home," she said. "I can't take all." "You can and you will. You made it. A man takes home the cake he made." She would not hear another word about it, and there is no use arguing with Mrs. Mathers when she will not hear another word about it. "Give some to your mother. Have a slice in the morning with your tea before the mill, and whatever the numbers do tomorrow, you'll have had a good thing first, and a good thing first changes the whole shape of a day." She had kept that one slice back for a reason of her own. She had whispered something good to the cake too, when Thomas wasn't looking, and she rather wanted to find out in the morning whether it had come true. At the door she helped him into his dry coat, and Thomas stood a moment, the warm cake in his hands, looking at her in the low gold light. "Mrs. M," he said, "thank you, not for the, well, for the cake, but not just the cake." "I know," said Mrs. Mathers. "Off you go. Mind the puddles." And she opened the door, and the cool, damp night air came in, smelling of wet earth and growing things and the clean, washed smell that comes after rain. And Thomas stepped out into it, warmed all the way through, carrying his warm cake, and he turned back once on the path to say good night. "Good night, Mrs. M." "Good night, Thomas." And then he was gone down the dark lane toward home, the cake held careful against the last of the rain, and Mrs. Mathers stood in her doorway a moment longer, watching after him the way she watched everyone she loved, which was as though she had all the time in the world. When she shut the door at last, the cottage was very quiet and very warm and very much hers. She banked the fire down low so it would keep through the night. She stood for a moment by the window, looking out at the dark garden and the rain that was nearly finished now, and she thought about her mother and her mother's hands working cold butter into flour in this very kitchen, and the words her mother had whispered to her about whispering to cakes. She thought about the dozen jars of jam she made every July, far too many, a nice even number, and how they always found their way out into the village one at a time, to the Ediths and the stuck cats and the heavy-hearted young men walking home in the rain. Far too many. Always exactly enough. Then Mrs. Mathers, who had spent her whole long life making a little too much of everything, so that there would always be enough to give away, put out the lamp and went up the narrow stairs to bed, and the cottage at the end of Wren Lane settled into the soft last hush of the rain. The fire glowed low and orange in the dark. The slice of cake waited on its blue-rimmed plate for the morning. And outside, very gently now, hardly more than a whisper, the rain saw itself the rest of the way out, and the village slept. And so by now, I hope, do you. Remember to enjoy some cake and to smile, because smiles sometimes get lonely, and it's best to let them out to greet others. When you're ready, or when life is hard, come back to the village. We'll be waiting, and Mrs. Mathers will have what you need, right when you need it. From the village hearth to wherever you rest. Be well, traveller. Visit the village again soon.